The Secure in Mind podcast series is an educational initiative of the Cybersecurity Advisors Network, or CIAN. CIAN is an international not-for-profit trust network of experts in technology, policy, ethics, and good practice. Our mission is to strengthen society's safety, resilience, and ability to fight against cybercrime and similar threats. Visit us at cybersecurityadvisors.network. Hello, and welcome back to CIAN's Secure in Mind series of video conversations and podcasts. I'm joined again by Bjørn Ihler, who is founder and director of the Khalifa Ihler Institute in Sweden, and also founder and CEO of Revontulet, a Norwegian consultancy. In both functions, Bjørn is an expert and international authority on the topics of terrorism and violent and extremist content. So, a fun topic for everybody today. CIAN, as you may be aware, hopefully also counts trust and safety among its many activities and objectives. And as part of this, we work with organizations and professionals around the world to help enhance and increase safety, security, resilience, and generally the accessibility to all of digital democracy, online trade and commerce, and general civil discourse, both on the internet and offline. So this is part two, as mentioned. We had a very, very interesting and educational conversation a few days ago with Bjørn on a number of topics, and it got so dense and extensive that we both decided it would be a good idea to have at least one follow-up, and we'll see where this one goes. So Bjørn, welcome back.
Thank you so much.
I'll if you want to, take 2 minutes to reintroduce yourself very quickly. I'll put your bio and links to everything in our blog post and YouTube and podcast pages. So, but just so people can have a quick reminder after 4 days who you are and what you do.
Yeah, I think you did a lot of good intro there, but I'm Bjørn Ihler. I've been working in counter-terrorism, counter-extremism for the last decade plus. I've been working increasingly with the tech sector in order to understand what threats terrorism pose to social media platforms in particular, but also how social media is being abused by violent extremists and terrorists to amplify their message. And so been working with trust and safety a lot as an element of that.
Great. Thank you. I'm just struggling with Zoom here with visibility, so I hope we can all see each other happily.
Well, I see you again now. So.
Perfect. There we go. I've got my profile on a window out here, and I'm still looking at I'm still looking for any good video conferencing tool that's easily understandable. Here we go. I think I just found it. I'm good with computer, as mentioned. So let's I think one thing that we often tend to forget with a concept as at the same time as vague and as emotionally charged as terrorism. We spent some time on what are the definitions of terrorism last time. Is that it has many dimensions. Whereas we are maybe accustomed from the news to thinking of it in terms of physical attacks, car bombs, shootings, hostage taking, whatever. You mentioned social media just right now, right?
Yeah.
I think what I want to get into this in a little bit. What is the online component that we often overlook, especially in the context of freedom of speech, but I think what would be a good bridge from our last conversation is I want to revisit the term itself.
Yeah.
I'm old, and I remember 2001. When a seeming I remember the late 70s and 80s, right, when the Palestinians mainly were hijacking a lot of planes, but not only. And the term had a huge rise then, but then post 9/11, post 9/11, sorry, there was a huge kind of rise in using the term terrorism, particularly in regards to Islamist terrorism, which is no longer right now, I think, one of the only focal areas of this activity and phenomenon. And I think a lot of people, myself included, felt that it was often overused. you mentioned last time also, well, both of us did that it kind of depends who is calling somebody a terrorist. Authoritarian states often abuse the concept and the term. Do you feel that it was overused? Do you feel that there has been a cheapening, or have people in recent years become more differentiated in their willingness to be conscious of what terrorism really is and how diverse and broad both the actors and their objectives are? Is this something that we are taking increasingly seriously as a society again?
Yeah, I think like it's hard to say whether it was overused or not, but it was certainly used in the context of the global war on terror, right? And all of the war efforts that kind of followed 9/11 and became very much kind of a crutch and justification for some pretty horrendous stuff there, including things that kind of amount to war crimes, etc. And so, like it's not just being abused by authoritarian governments, but also in that type of context, right? And so it's kind of it was used. It was terrorism. It's okay to call terrorists terrorists. I think where it landed was kind of in a fatigue among people and kind of the early 2010s, in particular, late 00s as well, to like there was just fatigue with the global war on terror and with our understanding of the terrorist threat in general, in particular in the West, where like terrorism became something we look at as like it's happening over there and not really a big issue here, and all of those things. And then with the rise of ISIS and with the increase in attacks by ISIS in Europe, kind of the focus came back a bit. And with that, kind of the justifiable attention on terrorism, in particular Islamic-inspired terrorism. And then in 2019, with the Christchurch attack, I think there was a massive readjustment that happened where we got a more kind of diversified perspective on what constitutes terrorism. At that point, ISIS had declined a bit in its prominence, but also we saw the Christchurch attack, which was live streamed on social media and things like that, creating kind of like a high impact, white supremacist kind of far right inspired terrorist attack, which kind of opened up the landscape to thinking about terrorism not solely from the perspective of Islamic inspired, but also more broadly as more far right inspired, and that really kind of like spun off into where we are now, where I think we're kind of fairly balanced in looking at the threat landscape in Europe and North America in particular, as divided between both on one hand the far right and also Islamic inspired terrorism, which still presents a risk in the West, right?
I apologize because I think that was a very loaded question. The I was projecting my own views, the overuse, but I think you put it really well when you mentioned fatigue, right?
Yeah.
And what I find really interesting is you mentioned Christchurch shooting, right?
Yeah.
If we think about what is terrorism, right? We had both Dunblane and Port Arthur were in 96. Columbine in the US was 99, right? Now, whether I'd say these guys were obviously all deranged, all terrorists. Strictly speaking, I don't know how much the ideological component was, except the definitely the Columbine guys. There was a lot of material.
Yeah,
this was all largely before social media.
Yeah.
And in my own home country, I'm just looking it up right now. There was the Swiss the Parliament shooting was in Zug in 2001, right? And again, at the advent of social media, and this guy was a disgruntled, deranged individual. And that, what you mentioned with the rise of IS in the 2010s, even though we've been heavily conditioned to associate, I think, terrorism by media and government sources in the early 2000s with Islamist, the more organic. I know you don't like the term lone wolf, or I don't know how you feel about the homegrown aspect, right?
Yeah.
We've been facing this for a while, and I think one
Yeah.
of the things that I at least remember as a citizen of Europe was when after 9/11, when you saw this tremendous rise in the use of the term terrorist. I was thinking, like, we've had ETA, we've had bombings, we've had IRA bombings. We've been facing this for quite a while.
Yeah.
I remember, like, Islamist bombings were happening with the Algerians, right? In
Yeah.
in Paris in the early 90s. I remember the trash bins being replaced by transparent bags. You know,
Yeah. I mean, like, there's nothing new to terrorism in Europe. Kind of following 9/11, we did see like the 7/7 attacks and things like that in the UK, but like compared to before Good Friday, like yeah, it's been safer. So yeah,
and I think this leads us to something. One of the things with Good Friday is that the is this idea of manifestos, right?
yeah,
Online presence, and this is good. Getting squarely into your area of expertise and your wheelhouse. One thing
yeah,
that I and a lot of people were shocked by. I want to say two things. I think was, first of all, with IS specifically, was the level of polish of their online media, their marketing materials, their websites, their videos. I mean, the evil bastards that they are aside, this was some high quality stuff, right? I mean,
yeah.
technically speaking,
I think
sounds
like that was reflected in their budgets as well, where like an IS fighter got paid like a quarter of what a IS cinematographer got paid.
really wow.
Yeah,
Okay. That makes sense. You want good
yeah,
you want good output. You pay your people. Well, IT CFOs and IT hiring people, are you listening? Um, and at the other thing that really shocked me was the growing awareness of the level of coordination and sophistication of the right wing, the extreme
yeah,
right. Um, I'm hesitant to say terrorists here. Let's say extremist
yeah,
groups, right? And the continuum of ideology that these exist on. So from far right to really, really, really far right in on sites like, we talked about Telegram last time. 8chan comes to mind, 4chan/Paul, even Reddit, and the evolution of the very polished meme culture
yeah.
that's been growing out of this, which is extremely manipulative, right?
Well, part of that is also like the homemade component is part of the appeal of meme culture, right? And so you've seen kind of the accessibility of tools for creation of content. Like Photoshop has been around for a while, but it's become easier and easier for people to create their own fairly polished content. But like the far right meme culture that emerged largely on 4chan, 8chan, etc. Like it looks homemade and shabby, and that is part of the visual language of that. But like we can go into some of that in greater detail.
And I'm just looking it up right now where I can find this. There was we talked a little bit about Robert Evans when we first met.
Yeah,
It's one of my his Behind the Bastards podcast series is one of my binging favorites. Very opinionated, but generally I think pretty well researched. And one of his episodes was with Frederick, the founder of 8chan.
yeah,
Guy in the Philippines who sounded at least extremely remorseful about what happened, and what the results of this were.
yeah,
Better late than never, I guess. But I mean, with the homegrown thing, two questions for you. Um, First of all, uh, I get the impression that even if the memes look homegrown, the level of sophistication and targeting. I mentioned Spain last time, and these
yeah,
these organized, what seem like organized campaigns to radicalize or at least ideologically shift young people, whether it's via TikTok, via Spanish Reddits, via whatever. The campaigns, the underlying targeting and logic seems very sophisticated. right?
Yeah.
Especially after Cambridge Analytica came to light, post Brexit. By the way,
Yeah.
strong plug to Chris Wiley's book, Mindfuck. I, as a non-expert, found this extremely shocking and enlightening. What are we? Is this really homegrown? Is this really some kid, sitting at home during COVID with too much time and Photoshop on his hands, um, kind of multiplying what we started seeing in the mid 2000s with 8chan, or is this a astroturfing kind of generally more cynical, more sinister phenomenon being driven by whether it's Russian disinformation actors, whether it's American right-wing groups, European right-wing groups that's seeking to manipulate especially younger and less technically literate people's online views via these kind of quote unquote rough around the edges, not at all as polished as the IS materials, memes.
I think there's a couple of dynamics happening simultaneously in some ways. Like ISIS was very centralized, and that was also part of their visual language. Like all ISIS content basically had logos, etc., which made it really easy to detect and take down. Like we hacked together a system at some point using copyright infringement tools to detect like the logos of TV channels. That was what it was developed for originally, to do like copyright infringement stuff on YouTube, etc. And we used that and trained that on like ISIS logos and basically took down content based on their own labeling of it, right? So like that strategy isn't great when it comes to longevity of having the content up, but at the same time, like the notoriety of it became a thing in and of itself. And that was possible with that centralized kind of media and communication structure that ISIS set up. As we discussed during our last session, like what we're looking at now is a more fragmented landscape. Like we're talking about nebulous networks to a greater extent. And so like what we do at Revontulet in particular is mapping out those nebulous networks and trying to figure out kind of how do they operate and work. And I think what we are seeing there is the complex dynamic between astroturfing, which certainly happens, as well as kind of this self-made extremist content, and the two play to each other within kind of just the nature of how social media works as well, where like outrage and clickbait works, right? Like it gets attention and through that amplification. And so we are seeing kind of the meme culture that emerged back in like the 2008, 2009 era on 4chan, etc., kind of pre-Gamergate and all of that. Like Pepe is old.
That was what I was that's one thing I was going to ask about, because even if it is not as centralized in terms of the iconography, you have your dog whistles, right? Which become increasingly, I don't want to say subtle, but kind of, in groups like the ADL, they track, hate symbols. It used to be the 14 letters or 88 and
14 words. Yeah.
The Nazis, right? 14 words. I'll link to all this in our notes, by the way.
Yeah.
The frog, as you mentioned, Kekistan, the three parentheses globalists,
Yeah.
And I mean, one thing I wanted to touch on quickly is Michael V. Hayden. So the former U.S. Director of National Intelligence, I think, guy who wrote a book called The Assault on Intelligence about the preludes to the 2015 U.S. Election. He made a really good point in an interview once, which is you cannot create divisions in society from outside, but you can definitely exploit and worsen them.
Yeah.
Right? With this astroturfing and meme culture, as you say, social media amplification of outrage culture. Once somebody has a wedge issue, right now what we see, in a lot of sections of the population is Israel and Palestine, right?
Yeah.
Right. Without going into an argument of what is what, it is really a divisive issue. Do you think that there are disinformation actors or organized campaigns that are using, these kind of divisions in society, whether, for example, among European youth, right?
Yeah.
Economic inequality, uncertainty, housing costs, that kind of stuff, that are basically using that as a way to introduce these dog whistles, these memes, these symbols that can then benefit from these organized, um, quantified, systematic campaigns to exploit and worsen divisions in society.
Definitely, and like this is where kind of the wedge issues become adopted by organized networks to a greater extent, right? Like, so you have like the memes that organically kind of originated more than a decade ago. About a decade ago, you had the rise of the identitarian movement in Europe, leading into kind of
We're just protecting
yeah,
European culture, right?
pretty much, but also like that was leaning pretty heavily on the meme culture to some extent.
Yeah.
And then that led into Pegida and things like that, which also like weaponized the global war on terror to spread Islamophobia, and all of that. And so that led into then like the COVID era with anti-vax and all of those things becoming kind of an element of the larger, both conspiratorial landscape as well as kind of part of the anti-establishment discourse. But that, to a large extent, also like ties into these larger European parties. So your AFD in Germany, FPÖ in Austria, Sweden Democrats here in Sweden, etc., that are kind of playing on the wedge issues, mixing that with a good portion of like the identitarianism, and throwing in some memes here and there. And that in turn leads into parliamentary politics, which is one element where we've
Funny
seen
enough,
kind of
if I can just very quickly, funny enough, if you, one example of this, the PVV in the Netherlands, right? Where I just read a poll yesterday that they're polling at their lowest since like, was it 2017 or so? When you actually
yeah.
get them into government, if they're not able to completely subvert the media and the judiciary, like Fidesz in Hungary, um, they actually don't really get stuff done. They don't pick up the trash. And
Yeah, in terms
it
of
only goes so far.
being in government is one of the worst things these parties can do for themselves, right? But part of it is also like, as we've seen here in Sweden, it was revealed I think last year that the Sweden Democrats had their own troll farm. So they basically in without leaning on like Russian troll farms, they had established their own here in Sweden, to do like their own homegrown kind of thing in terms of manipulating the information landscape, right? And so like that is one channel through which like the astroturfing becomes real, and the kind of information warfare element becomes real. And then in addition to that, you have the foreign influence element to that, where we do see things like Russia wanting to amplify wedge issues in Europe to sow discord, to create a less unified Europe, in particular in relation to the escalation of the war in Ukraine, for instance, where like a weaker Europe means greater success for Russia. And so like that's a fairly no-brainerish issue
Founding.
there, where there's both kind of funding going to some of this as well as like social media amplification. And that's sometimes just through like a farm of Russian teenagers sitting in like a abandoned apartment building, clicking on things on Facebook. Um, and so there's kind of that aspect, and then you have outside of like the parliamentary politics, the more kind of polishment of the extremist and terroristic organizations on the far right, where we mentioned in our last conversation, Terrogram being one aspect, where Terrogram was actually to some extent led by a graphic designer. Uh, and they published these zines, like magazines of really kind of high-end graphic design.
The youth's zines were a cool thing in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, and so these are leaning somewhat on like the aesthetics of like anarchist scenes from the 80s and 90s, but being Nazi about them and containing instructions on things like attacks substations of power rail networks. Again, something we've seen people act on, etc. And so,
It's a natural. It's somehow it's a
yeah,
natural because I remember when okay, it's kind of a lot of it's nonsense, but I remember when the anarchist cookbook was this cool thing in when I was in junior high school. And
Yeah,
oh, yeah, you know, we can build bombs and stuff. And you know, the poor man's James Bond, that kind of stuff. And this idea of at the time it wasn't so much the right-wing ecosystem because that was, but that to some degree grew out of that. Right. So
yeah.
so this is really interesting because it really I can see the long history behind that.
Yeah, I mean, like a lot of this harkens back to Ted Kaczynski, it harkens back to the Oklahoma City bombing, etc. Like things that predates internet culture, right?
Right.
And this is all where like the translation from like the online meme culture back into kinetic violence really happens.
Mhm.
And so I think it's important to kind of understand that point where like we aren't just talking shit about doing things anymore. We are actually taking that offline into physical reality and murdering children.
Right.
Which, like,
This
at the end
this
of the day, is what we're really concerned about happening.
what I find interesting here is, you know, you mentioned the Russian troll farm. I mean, this is classic, you know, Alexander Dugin Foundations of Geopolitics material, where basically, you know, my enemy's weakness is my strength, right? Zero
Yeah,
sum game. What I also found really interesting is the finding that a lot of the at least the American right wing memes were a bunch of guys out of I think Macedonia or Montenegro that were using it basically to boost like online scams essentially. Like
yeah.
they don't care about the politics. They're just monetizing it,
Oh,
right?
this distance between monetization and scams and like actual far right stuff is minimal at best, right? And we'll see this largely in the alternative health world, where
Oh yeah.
like
Yeah, yeah.
one of the things I did an analysis of kind of the podcast, the far right podcast landscape for a client in Norway a few years ago, and what we saw was like the vitamin salespeople were the ones funding all of the far right
Well, the
podcasts.
grift, the
Which,
grift, the grift,
yeah,
especially on the right wing side of things right now. I'm not saying they're the only ones, but the grift is an eternal phenomenon.
yeah, and
Um,
that's also like where like some of our work towards the financial services sector also like goes full circle on like, yeah,
yeah.
we're working on terrorism and violent extremism, but also like, hey, this really detects a lot of fraud. It detects a lot of like the grifty, scammy stuff that is just happening on online marketplaces, but also that's happening in kind of like crowdfunding campaigns, etc. So yeah,
Back to the back very briefly before we move on to something really fun. Promise. Back to the meme side of things. Even though these are no longer these polished IS things, you know, you mentioned, for example, a copyright imagery tracking tool. There's a couple of things like that out there, right? And
yeah.
and 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 analysis tools are getting smarter and smarter, even if you know YouTube's copyright violation detection tools aren't. Hi, YouTube. Um, um, how are you spotting these? I mean, you've got a team of analysts at Revontulet. I
Yeah.
mean, this eventually you're going to have common symbology and terminology that people agree on, whether it's organic or manufactured, and that in turn should, for me as a, you know, I deal with, I've dealt primarily with a lot of cyber threat intelligence, right, where you have
Yeah.
very quantifiable, objective metrics and indicators of compromise, for example, that you can spot. Right,
Yeah.
there's strings, there's patterns, but I mean, isn't it the kind of the same thing that your analysts can basically see? Okay, this is this new symbol, right? I don't know, Paddington
Yeah.
being, for example, if that were to become like a symbol of the far right, and we could then spot. It's not. I like Paddington. Sorry, but
Let's not go down that route. We'll get
sorry, sorry,
the
sorry,
entire
sorry,
British
sorry,
Empire
sorry,
against
sorry. You
us.
know, Cthulhu, right? Plush Cthulhu. Let's say, you know, evil, great Lord Cthulhu being used by the far right as a symbol.
Yeah.
Would that be? Is that the kind of thing that analysts are then, you know, going into these forums to spot and say, okay, this is now a known symbol that we can track?
So there's a couple of things we do. So at Revontulet, we have like built out what we're calling our like extremist DNA system, basically, where like we have picked apart like what are the elements of symbology and ideology, etc., that exist within different extremist spheres. So like we like the easiest one that everyone kind of knows is like a swastika is a swastika, but like a
Mhm.
swastika in use is often by Nazis. And so like that is one element. But then like what we are looking at and how we're kind of modeling our behavioral analysis tooling is by understanding the context within which some of these elements exist as well. So like if you're both sharing a swastika and saying like Sieg Heil and 88 and 14 words and all of that,
You're
like
probably not a Buddhist.
yeah, that amplifies the likelihood that you're worth some attention from us and our friends. And so like we're looking at behaviors in networks, like how individuals are interacting with each other, but also how they are interacting with content that contains these different elements that we've identified in like a massive catalog, basically, of like keywords, dog whistles, imagery, audio, etc. So we're kind of a multimodal approach. What we're also doing is figuring out how to use AI to better analyze for a bunch of that content.
That was going to be one of my questions again.
Yeah.
The contextual pattern analysis, context being everything.
So the contextual pattern analysis really helps the AI in knowing what to look for where, if that makes sense. Because like one thing is like just saying like, hey, look for every swastika in the world, which doesn't really help anyone. But look for swastikas within this specific network of users that we know are dealing with more problematic or dangerous stuff. Like that is more actionable and useful to us and to clients. And so that's where kind of the behavior element, the context element is really central. And what that also allows us to do is kind of tweak in real time based on human observations. So like, as you say, we do have a human intelligence team that goes into some of these spaces and observe behavior, and behavior changes over time. And like, what is a Nazi meme today isn't necessarily the same as what's a Nazi meme tomorrow.
Pepe the Frog.
Yeah. And so, yeah, we're modeling and monitoring for like what are the changes over time. So that is one factor that requires the human intervention in order to tweak our work there. But then there's also the fact that a lot of what we're working with social media platforms in particular on is ban evasion. And so we've infiltrated and sat in on meetings on Discord with extremist groups that have been discussing as new guidelines for content moderation on Discord came out, where the boundaries are and like how to go up to the line but not cross the line in terms of content on there. And what we're seeing a lot of the time is that they then refer people off to less moderated platforms, so typically Telegram, right? And so often on like mainstream social media, so your Facebooks, etc., you'll see like an image. In that image there might be a QR code. If you scan that QR code, you're suddenly in like a Telegram channel with horrendous terrorist stuff.
But also it's what I find extremely interesting is that this touches on, what you see quite often, this these kinds of extremist groups very cynically masquerading as supposedly reasonable content. Oh, I'm just asking questions, right?
Yeah.
And it also what I find, we've only got a few minutes. What I'd like to do is just before we wrap up, I'd like to continue this conversation. We'll take a 5-minute break and then go on if you're up for that.
Sure.
I've got time. Great. This is good.
Yeah.
I saw a video on Reddit the other day, right? Which is two obviously young North African men tearing down rainbow flags from a gay bar in Paris, right? Now, it's obviously real. It's obviously a real issue. Yeah. Right. We have a lot of homophobia in certain communities. At the same time, these kinds of images are very often very cynically used by groups with, let's say, an agenda, right?
Yeah.
So the human factor, the human, I find it very interesting that the need for the kind of the man in the loop aspect of AI, because as I told you, my domain that I've had for over 25 years is turns out to be an extremely anti-Semitic trope, and it was hosted on another domain that was registered completely innocently, which was also an anti-Semitic trope, and an AI would immediately flag that and think that somebody who looks like me, right, is going to be the Aryan poster boy, and oh God, we have neo-Nazis, right? Whereas about as far from it as I can possibly get. So I find it really interesting that the need, the increasing use of automation to spot these kinds of things being able to identify and track these kind of quote unquote squishy, soft ways of trying to evade bans and really sail hard on the limits of what's acceptable or not without violating them.
Yeah, no, and I think like that's where understanding individuals just not just as the breadcrumbs they leave on one specific social media platform, but their kind of complex behavior across platforms into physical reality, etc. Like you need a bigger picture to have that clear picture of like what is what, and through that you can make better decisions. And so like we're in the better decisions game, right? Like we want people to have as much information as possible to make the best and most informed choices possible, so that the people who are targeted by our work are the correct people. Like we don't want like wide swaths of bans or anything like that. Like we want to be as targeted as possible to ensure that like it's okay to have like political discourse, right? Like if we're just like saying no to everything, then like suddenly like we have a massive infringement on people's ability to function in society.
And it also goes in, I don't remember who the U.S. Supreme Court justice was, but there's this famous quote about obscenity from, I think it's the 1920s or so.
Yeah.
I know it when I see it.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, humans have this in AI, LLMs are, I'm going to refer to, Emily Bender from the University of Washington, somebody I follow, about the limitations of large language models. Humans, they're not human, right? They're not intelligent. They are garbage in, garbage out, essentially, with some mechanics. Humans can spot this kind of context and make subjective decisions. And I think it's up to us as a society and as individuals to figure out, how do we ensure that these do not violate fundamental rights, individual rights, etc. And how do we allow humans like analysts, for example, to make those judgment calls based on principles, based on rules and norms, at the same time as giving them the flexibility and speed to be able to detect these things. I would suggest let's take a quick break, and jump back in with part, let's say 2.2 of this conversation. Because what I just mentioned is going to lead us into a rabbit hole that is going to really piss some people off. So
that's always fun.
Always fun. Thanks. To see you in a little bit, and stay tuned, everybody. Thank you for joining us in this latest edition of the Secure in Mind podcast series, courtesy of the Cybersecurity Advisors Network. Visit us at cybersecurityadvisors.network/media and /blog for additional episodes and articles. Follow us on LinkedIn, YouTube, SoundCloud, Podcast Republic, and iTunes, and don't hesitate to get in touch. Stay safe, stay smart, stay educated, and stay secure.